This is a vintage history of Saginaw Township, Michigan, as was published in the History of Saginaw County, Michigan by James Cooke Mills in 1918. So it doesn't bring things current, but it has some interesting early history. So let us proceed with the history of Saginaw Township, Michigan. Until 1822, all the county north of Oakland County, comprising the unorganized counties of Saginaw, Lapeer, Sanilac, and Shiawassee, was still under the jurisdiction of the territorial government of Michigan, of which Lewis Cass was the governor. No county organizations had yet been created in this wilderness of forest and swamp, and the primitive settlement of the Saginaw had not known a tax collector at that time. But on September 10th of that year, Lewis Cass issued a proclamation laying out the county of Saginaw to be organized whenever the competent authority for the time being shall so determine, and that until then the said county shall be attached to and compose a part of Oakland County. This is that being from a transcript of the proclamation declaring that or setting aside Saginaw County. Now, Saginaw Township itself was organized in 1830, where a legislative act was passed authorizing the organization of the township of Saginaw to embrace within its limits the entire county as laid out by the governor's proclamation. This act took effect on April 4, 1831. Included in this territory were townships 13 and 14 north of ranges 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 east, and now forming a part of Bay County, and townships 9 north, ranges 5 and 6 east, which is now part of Genesee County. At a meeting of the pioneer settlers held in a block house within the old stockade, Gardner D. Williams was elected to represent the township on the County Board of Oakland. Ephraim S. Williams was chosen township clerk and A.W. Bacon treasurer. David Standard, Elizur Jewett, and Charles McLean were elected overseers of the districts of Saginaw, Greenpoint, and Tittabawasseg, and Elizur Jewett was appointed the deputy surveyor. In 1831, an act was passed creating a seat of justice at Saginaw City, and again Gardner D. Williams and David Stannard were appointed justices. The Township Board, as thus constituted, administered the civic affairs of a territory as large as some of the eastern states, and its duties were so effectively conducted that within 4 years the Territorial Legislative Council organized the district into the county of Saginaw. The organization thus effected was in force on and after February 2nd, 1835, and for an account of those proceedings, you can be found in Volume 1 of the history which I am sharing with you right now, which is Volume 2. Various townships set off. In the following years, the several townships of Saginaw County were set off from the central or main township known as Saginaw. Saginaw City was also superimposed upon its eastern sections, and at length its territory was reduced to its present area. In some instances, the township boundaries did not conform to town or range lines, but followed the conflagration of main waterways. This was for the convenience of the inhabitants, as there were as yet no bridges spanning the largest rivers, and in order to form more compact rural communities. The advantage of this to the early pioneers, if not to the landholders of later generations, is evident by a glance at a map of the county showing the established boundaries of the Saginaw River between Saginaw and Buena Vista Townships, the Tittabawassee River between Saginaw and James and Thomastown, and the Shiawassee between James and Springfield Townships. As present constituted, Saginaw Township comprises a little more than 25 sections in Town 12 north of ranges 3 and 4 east. Some pioneer settlers. The pioneer settlers of Saginaw Township, almost without exception, selected the bottomlands along the Tittabawassee for their farms. David Stannard and Charles McLean came in the winter of 1828, the former entering land afterward known as the Court Farm, while the latter settled on 40 acres adjoining what was later the Bacon Farm. Stannard brought a run of stone for grinding corn, and McLean was the first farmer to raise wheat in the township. Now in 1829, Loren Riggs and John Brown came from New York and settled on land 1 mile above Greenpoint. Riggs owned the first two-horse lumber wagon ever brought here, and for a time conducted a trading post at Greenpoint. Stephen Benson came at about that time, and Edward McCarty and son. Thomas arrived in August 1830 and settled on lands contiguous to the Tittabawassee several miles above its mouth. Early in 1830, Grosvenor Vinton settled on land which in recent years was owned by Benjamin McCaulfield, and which he worked until December 1834. At different times, it was said, he journeyed to Pontiac to have his grain ground into flour, the trip requiring 9 days. Vinton was one of the 15 voters at the first township meeting in April of 1831. He was married on August 25, 1831, to Miss Harriet Whitney, being the first white person married in Saginaw County. Their first child, Sarah, afterwards Mrs. Samuel Dickinson, was born May 9, 1833. Thomas Simpson, otherwise known as Elixir Boga, was a witness to the signing of the Treaty of Saginaw in September of 1819 and came to Saginaw as a permanent resident in 1832. He lived in a small log hut within the old fort and was of peculiarly belligerent nature, addicted to the excessive use of whiskey, and when threatening an assault would exclaim in the thunderous tones, "I will give him the Elixir Boga." And in 1847, Simpson kept the lighthouse at the mouth of the Saginaw River. Close relations with the Indians. And I will warn you, as I begin this, I am not real good with Indian names, so I beg your kind patience. During the early formative period of Saginaw, the relations between the whites and the native lords of the forest were generally very friendly. The fur traders, as a matter of expediency, treated the Indians quite kindly, while exchanging their furs for guns, firewater, and the trinkets of the East, with profit ever in mind. The whole enterprise depended upon the goodwill and liberal patronage of the redskins, and every incentive was given them in hunting and trapping in the interminable forests. The friendliness and kindly spirit of pioneer days extended to the permanent settlers, largely as a measure of personal safety. They were peaceable people, of which industry and thrift were dominant traits, and were not as a rule inclined to quarrel with the aboriginal holders of the land. But in consequence of this policy, the Indians came to the settlements in large numbers and mingled freely with the whites in general trade. Some of the well-known chiefs of the Chippewas who roamed the forest about Saginaw and lived in the villages on or near Tittabawassee, were Osawamek, Osawaban, Naquachikaming, Shawi no Sigeka, Mizkobinasa, and later Shopin-Agans. Numerous incidents concerning these chieftains have been related by our pioneers, some of which appear in the early chapters of this work, which treat the most primitive of times. One story in particular about this noted chief, Naquachikaming, casts an amusing sidelight upon his character and is here recorded. And it's Naquachikaming draws his will. This big chieftain was a good Indian, simple in his taste, primitive in his ideas of right and wrong, but kind-hearted, sensitive, and honest. While suffering from the effects of an accident whereby several ribs were broken and other injuries inflicted, and because of his advanced age, he feared his end was near and decided to make a will for the legal disposition of his property. Now, like all Indians, he was very superstitious, but did not allow his imagination to lead him from his strict sense of the truth. To carry out this design, he called to his wigwam a friend who was a lawyer, and with a clear mind laid the matter before him. First in the list of his legatees, he mentioned the children by two wives then living with him, then a favorite grandchild, and finally some other children by former wives. "But," said the friend, "you have neglected to make provision for the wives who are now living with you." "Oh, I forgot them," replied the chief, "but never mind." True to his barbarous instinct, which regards women as of little consequence, he decided not to change the will, but to leave the wives to the care of their sons should he be taken away. The list of children by other wives, all of whom he had thought of and cared enough about to provide for in his will, though many were men and women grown, being somewhat lengthy, the friend remarked that the old chief had been much married in his time. "Oh, not so much," the chief replied, somewhat abashed at the view his pale-faced friend took of his easy domestic habits for a period of more than 50 years. "Only 10, he said, "but it's not my fault. They all fell in love with me." Shortly after, on October 26, 1874, the old chief passed to the happy hunting grounds at the advanced age, it was believed, of more than 90 years. His son Jim, well known in these parts, was also a good Indian, and he died about 1892. Indian landmarks. The landmarks and relics left by the aboriginal owners of the land in Saginaw Township are numerous, having Greenpoint, at the confluence of the Tittabawassee and Shiawassee rivers, having been a favorite camping place of the savages. The mounds at this place are still plainly marked, but so ancient are they that trenches made through the largest by Fred Dustin several years ago revealed nothing beyond decayed bones and a few teeth. Other remains were caches formed by the Redskins for the storage of chipped blades of chert and implements and articles of domestic use, and cultural pits used for keeping corn, smoked meats, and other provisions. The latter were merely excavations in the ground from 5 to 10 feet in diameter, carefully lined with bark, and supported by poles, and roofed with the same materials. Remains of a beaver dam. Although the forests of Saginaw Valley were overrun with wild animals, the natural prey of the Indians and white men, but few remains exist as a reminder of extinct species. But a few years ago, Mr. Dustin called attention to a plainly marked beaver dam of ancient origin discovered in Section 28 of Saginaw Township. It was on land known as the Miller Farm, a few rods from the turn of the road, an extension of South Michigan Avenue, and to the Merrill Bridge. The outline was very clearly defined, and it was evident that its length was more than 120 feet and its width about 8 feet. About 40 feet from where the structure begins, at the south end, stood a white oak tree 2 feet in diameter and probably more than 100 years old, while at the extreme north end was the remains of a good-sized beech stump. The center of the dam was long since washed out, leaving an opening about 15 feet wide, but its original state, the dam impounded a body of water at least 4 feet deep. Back of the dam were several slight mounds, which were probably the remains of beaver houses. There were no beavers thereabout after 1850, according to verified accounts of the pioneers as article of trade. Running through the woods in a northwesterly direction was a still plainly marked lumbering road, used evidently by pioneer loggers in this section. Home industry of the pioneers. During this period of hardship and privation, when the future of each family depended entirely upon the industry and thrift of its own members, practically all necessities, both of food and raiment, were produced from its own soil and the cabin fireside. The land produced the grain, corn, and vegetables upon which the settlers thrived, and game and fish, which, with an occasional supply of pork, supplemented the daily fare. At the fireside, their rough yet warm and comfortable garments were fashioned, the spinning wheel humming to the tune of industry in the settler's home. Their vegetable gardens were objects of special pride, and the villagers rivaled each other in the excellence of their products. Their earnest efforts were not always successful, however, due, as our struggles today, to uncertain weather and other causes beyond the control of the gardener. One of these once described his summer gardening operations, and he said, "The bugs ate our cucumbers, the bird ate the bugs, neighbor's cat ate the birds, and we now are in hopes of something that will eat the cats." Good roads. Although the original roads through the township were mere Indian trails widened to permit the passage of wagons and teams, these have long since disappeared, and broad highways, well-drained and surfaced with hard materials, have taken their place. Since Saginaw Township is contiguous to the city, whose principal avenues lead directly into the county districts, the main roads are much traveled and are constantly improved to keep pace with the march of progress. In 1918, there are 19½ miles of stone roads in the township, some roads being as heavily traveled as any in the county. During that year, about 7½ miles of new stone roads were built, notably to the East River Road from State Street to the south line of Tittabawassee Township, a distance of about 6 miles. This road is part of the Saginaw Midland Highway, which eventually will be extended northward through the central counties to the Straits of Mackinac. When this becomes an actuality, Saginaw will be on the map of the Dixie Highway, extending from Mackinac to Jacksonville, Florida. The railroads operating in Saginaw Township are the Pierre Marquette, which crosses the northeastern sections into Kochville, and thence across the state to Ludington and Manistee, and the Michigan Central, which runs westerly from the city along the line between sections 28 and 33 and 29 and 32, and curving toward the south crosses the Tittabawassee in the later section. The farming community is so well served by the nearby markets in the city as to render railroad shipping depots unnecessary in this township, and there are no stations within its boundaries. Good highways and substantial bridges to the adjoining townships bring the farmer close to the city, and he is able to haul large loads of beans, beets, corn, and grains direct to large markets. This is a rich farming section of Saginaw Township, and it is not excelled in that fertility of the soil which brings wealth to the busy farmer. In 1918, the township officers were Charles Castorif, supervisor, Albert M. Butts, clerk, Louis Seidel, treasurer, and R. Storch, highway commissioner. And that completes this quite interesting early history of Saginaw Township. Thanks for stopping by and taking a listen.